Before learning the genesis of each wave on an ECG, one should be knowing the basic physics behind the ECG. In this video, let's learn some basic physics behind the ECG. Let's start with the direction. A deflection above the isoelectric line is considered positive and a deflection below the isoelectric line is considered negative. What do I really mean by this statement? Let me make it more clear for you. This is what you call as the isoelectric line or the neutral line. So whatever is above the isoelectric line is positive. Whatever is below the isoelectric line is negative. But how? This totally depends on the direction of the travel of the average electrical vector and the position of the electrodes. Imagine this is a heart. And this is the average electrical vector. You have placed an electrode here and another here. Let us name this electrode as E1 and this electrode as E2. Surprisingly, for the same electrical activity in the heart, electrode number E1 is going to give you a, guess it, positive deflection. And the electrode number E2 is going to give you a negative deflection. But how does this really work? It means that if the vector is traveling towards an electrode, the corresponding electrode is going to give you a positive deflection. And if the vector is traveling away from an electrode, the corresponding electrode is going to give you a negative deflection. That's it. Now let's come to the magnitude. The magnitude of the deflection totally depends on two factors. The first one is the quantum of the electrical forces generated by the heart. The second one is the extent to which they are transmitted to the recording electrode. It's very simple. So the quantum of the electrical forces generated by the heart, what does it really mean? It means the total of the average electrical vector. It can increase in conditions like ventricular hypertrophy or hyperthyroidism. And the extent to which they are transmitted to the recording electrode means exactly the gap between the cardiac tissue and the recording electrode. If it increases, the magnitude decreases, and if it decreases, the magnitude increases. What do I really mean? If the patient is lean or his chest wall is thin, there's a very little gap between the cardiac tissue and the recording electrode. So the extent to which they are transmitted to the recording electrode increases and the average vector or the average magnitude of the deviation increases. And let's see conditions in which the magnitude decreases. Conditions like pericardial effusion, pleural effusion, where there is fluid between the myocardium or the cardiac tissue and the recording electrode. In this condition, the extent to which they are transmitted is decreasing. In conditions like pneumothorax, pneumopericardium, there is the presence of air between the cardiac tissue and the recording electrode. This decreases the extent to which they are transmitted. Conditions like hypothyroidism and mixed edema also decreases the quantum of the electrical forces generated by the heart. Infiltrative diseases like hemochromatosis, amyloidosis, both decreases the quantum of the electrical forces generated by the heart. As I said earlier, if the patient is obese, there is presence of a lot of fat tissues between the cardiac tissue and the recording electrode. This decreases the extent to which the electric vector is transmitted to the recording electrode. So it decreases the magnitude. Hope it is clear for everyone. Now let's see some peculiar aspects about the activation of the electrical activity in atria and the ventricles. The activation of electrical activity in atria and ventricles differ. How? Let me make it clear for you. In the atria, the electrical activation happens from one myocyte to another. So, the deviation on an ECG represents the atrial enlargement, while in the ventricles, the activation happens from endocardium to epicardium. Endocardium to epicardium. So here the deviation on the ECG represents ventricular hypertrophy. You'll be thinking that, aren't both the same? Enlargement is not the same as ventricular hypertrophy? No, it's not. Enlargement is simply the increase in volume of the chamber, while hypertrophy is increase in the number of the tissues. While seeing the next videos about ECG, you will understand this more clearly. But for now, you just understand that the deviation on the ECG strip in the atrial activity increases, or it represents the increase in the volume, and deviation of electrical activity on an ECG strip in the ventricular phase represent the ventricular hypertrophy. It is differing because of the activation of the atria, and the ventricle differs. In the atria, the activation happens from one myocyte to the another, and in the ventricles, the activation happens from endocardium to epicardium. So that's why the electrical activity of the atria represents its enlargement or the increase in the volume of the chamber, and the electrical activity of the ventricle represents its hypertrophy or the increase in the number of the tissues. That's all you have to know before learning individual waves on an ECG. Thank you for listening. If you like the content, subscribe to the channel.